The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 17-year-old Marcus Washington stood at the Family Feud podium, with his shoulders squared in the military posture his father had taught him, his eyes holding the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that sometimes the world punishes you, not for what you've done, but for what others believe you're capable of doing. When Steve Harvey asked about the most unfair thing that ever happened to you, Marcus's response, delivered with the controlled anger of someone who had been forced to watch his entire future crumble based on a lie, would reveal how quickly a false accusation can destroy years of hard work, dreams, and the kind of reputation that takes a lifetime to build but only seconds to destroy. "Losing everything because of something I didn't do," Marcus had said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of 8 months spent watching college scholarships disappear, watching teachers who had once praised him avoid eye contact, watching classmates whisper and point as he walked through hallways where he had once been respected and admired. "Being expelled from school for stealing something I never stole, from a place I never went, at a time when I wasn't even there." The studio had fallen into the kind of heavy silence that comes when people realize they're witnessing not just personal tragedy, but systemic failure. The recognition that sometimes the very institutions designed to protect and nurture young people can become instruments of destruction when prejudice, assumption, and the rush to judgment override evidence, logic, and basic principles of justice. Marcus Washington had been a model student at Lincoln High School, carrying a 3.8 GPA while participating in varsity basketball, student government, and community service projects that had earned him recognition from local newspapers and recommendations from teachers who had expected him to be accepted to prestigious universities with academic and athletic scholarships. He had been planning to major in engineering, had already received preliminary interest from several college recruiters, and had been on track to become the first person in his family to attend a 4-year university. The accusation that had destroyed Marcus's life had come from Sarah Mitchell, a classmate who claimed that Marcus had stolen her iPhone from her locker during lunch period on a Tuesday in March. Sarah had reported the theft to the school administration, claiming that she had seen Marcus near her locker and that her phone had disappeared shortly afterward. When the phone was found in Marcus's backpack during a search conducted by school security, the case had seemed straightforward to administrators who were under pressure to address a recent increase in theft complaints. But Marcus had been in the library during the entire lunch period, working on a research paper for his advanced placement history class. He had been sitting at a table with 3 other students who could verify his presence, had checked out books using his student ID card that created a time-stamped record of his activity, and had even spoken with the librarian about research resources at the exact time Sarah claimed he was stealing her phone. The evidence of his innocence had been clear, documented, and easily verifiable. However, the school's investigation had been cursory and biased. Rather than thoroughly examining the evidence that proved Marcus's innocence, administrators had focused on the fact that the phone had been found in his possession, assuming that this discovery validated Sarah's accusation regardless of other evidence. They had dismissed the testimony of the students who had been with Marcus, had ignored the library records that proved his whereabouts, and had refused to consider alternative explanations for how the phone might have ended up in his backpack. The disciplinary hearing had been a formality rather than a genuine investigation. Marcus and his parents had presented clear evidence of his innocence, including witness statements, library records, and a detailed timeline that made it impossible for him to have committed the theft. But the school board had been more concerned with appearing decisive and tough on crime than with ensuring that justice was served. They had expelled Marcus for the remainder of the school year and had recommended that criminal charges be filed against him. The impact on Marcus's life had been immediate and devastating. His acceptance to several universities had been rescinded when the schools learned of his expulsion, his basketball scholarship opportunities had disappeared overnight, and his reputation in the community had been destroyed by rumors and speculation about his alleged criminal behavior. Teachers who had once been mentors had become distant and suspicious, friends had abandoned him to protect their own reputations, and Marcus had found himself isolated and branded as a thief despite overwhelming evidence of his innocence. The criminal case had been even more frustrating than the school proceedings. Although the prosecutor had eventually dropped charges due to lack of evidence, the legal process had taken months during which Marcus had been unable to attend school, had missed crucial academic and athletic opportunities, and had watched his college prospects evaporate. Even after the charges were dismissed, the stigma of the accusation had followed him, making it nearly impossible to rebuild the life and reputation that had been destroyed by false allegations. Marcus's parents, David and Patricia Washington, had fought tirelessly to clear their son's name, hiring attorneys, appealing the school's decision, and demanding a thorough investigation that would reveal the truth. They had spent their savings on legal fees, had taken time off work to attend hearings and meetings, and had watched helplessly as their son's dreams were destroyed by a system that seemed more interested in finding someone to blame than in finding the truth. The most devastating aspect of Marcus's situation had been the way it had revealed the fragility of reputation and the speed with which false accusations could destroy years of hard work and achievement. Marcus had learned that being innocent wasn't enough to protect him from the consequences of other people's assumptions, that his character and track record meant nothing when weighed against the testimony of an accuser and the convenience of a quick resolution. The toll on Marcus's mental health had been severe. He had developed anxiety and depression as he watched his future disappear, had struggled with feelings of powerlessness and betrayal, and had begun to question whether hard work and good behavior actually mattered in a world where lies could be more powerful than truth. He had withdrawn from friends and family, had stopped participating in activities he had once loved, and had felt like his life had been put on hold while he waited for justice that seemed unlikely to come. The Family Feud appearance had been arranged by Patricia Washington, who had thought that appearing on television might provide a positive experience for Marcus during a period defined by disappointment and injustice. She had hoped that celebrating their family's bond and resilience might help Marcus begin to rebuild his confidence and sense of self-worth that had been so thoroughly damaged by the false accusation and its consequences. During the pre-show preparations, Marcus had been quiet and reserved, participating in the required activities but clearly carrying the weight of his recent experiences. The production team had been impressed by his maturity and intelligence, noting that he seemed unusually serious and thoughtful for someone his age, but they hadn't understood the trauma and injustice that had shaped his recent experience. The game had been proceeding with Marcus participating appropriately but without the enthusiasm and energy typical of teenage contestants. The Washington family was competing against the Rodriguez family from Arizona, and while both sides had been playing with good humor, there was something subdued about Marcus's participation that suggested he was going through the motions rather than genuinely enjoying the experience. But when it came time for the category "The Most Unfair Thing That Ever Happened to You," and it was Marcus's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck directly at the heart of the injustice that had defined the past 8 months of his life and destroyed everything he had worked to achieve. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about Marcus's serious demeanor and the weight in his posture had made Steve more attentive and respectful than usual. "All right, Marcus," Steve had said gently, "the most unfair thing that ever happened to you. What comes to mind?" Marcus had looked at Steve with eyes that held depths of experience and disillusionment that seemed impossible for someone so young, then at his parents, who were watching with obvious pain and pride, then back at Steve with the kind of honesty that comes from someone who has nothing left to lose. "Losing everything because of something I didn't do," Marcus had said, his words carrying 8 months of frustration, anger, and the recognition that sometimes being innocent isn't enough. "Being expelled from school for stealing something I never stole, from a place I never went, at a time when I wasn't even there." Steve had paused, immediately recognizing that this young man was describing something far more serious than typical teenage complaints about fairness. "Marcus," Steve had said with obvious concern, "that sounds like a serious accusation. Can you tell me what happened?" Marcus had taken a breath, seeming to gather the courage to share his story with a television audience that would include people who might already have formed opinions about his guilt or innocence. "A girl at my school said I stole her phone," Marcus had explained. "She said she saw me near her locker, and when they searched my bag they found her phone. But I was in the library the whole time with witnesses. I had library records proving where I was. I couldn't have done what she said I did." The studio audience had become completely attentive, understanding that they were hearing about a serious miscarriage of justice involving a young person's future. "Did the school investigate the evidence that proved you were innocent?" Steve had asked. "They found the phone in my bag, and that was enough for them," Marcus had replied. "They didn't care about the witnesses, the library records, or the fact that I was somewhere else when it happened. They expelled me, I lost my scholarships, my college acceptances were rescinded, and my reputation was destroyed." Steve had looked at Marcus with growing respect for his composure and obvious intelligence. "Marcus," Steve had said, "how has this affected your future plans?" "I was going to be the first person in my family to go to college," Marcus had said, his voice beginning to show emotion. I had scholarship offers, acceptance letters, a plan for my life. All of that is gone because someone lied, and the system believed the lie instead of the evidence. Steve had glanced at David and Patricia Washington, who were clearly emotional as they watched their son describe the destruction of his dreams. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington," Steve had said, "how has this affected your family?" "It's been devastating," Patricia had replied, tears in her eyes. "We raised Marcus to believe that if you work hard and do the right thing, good things will happen. This has shown him that sometimes that's not true." David had nodded in agreement, his voice thick with emotion. "My son is not a thief," David had said firmly. "He's never been in trouble, never even had a detention, but the school was more interested in closing the case than finding the truth." Steve had looked at Marcus with obvious respect and determination. "Marcus," Steve had said, "what you've experienced is one of the worst kinds of injustice, being punished for something you didn't do. But I want you to know that your character, your integrity, and your intelligence are still intact. They can't take that away from you." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, understanding that this moment required both recognition of the injustice Marcus had suffered and affirmation of his worth and potential. "Marcus," Steve had said, placing the jacket around his shoulders, "this jacket represents something important today. It represents the understanding that sometimes the system fails, but that doesn't mean you failed. Your truth is still your truth, regardless of who believes it." Marcus had pulled the jacket closer, the weight and dignity of the gesture providing some comfort amid the ongoing pain of his situation. Steve had turned to address the studio audience and the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve had announced, "Marcus Washington is showing us something important about character and resilience. He's been falsely accused, wrongly punished, and had his future stolen by people who were supposed to protect him. But he's still here, still standing, still believing in truth and justice." Steve had looked directly into the camera with obvious passion. "This young man deserves better than what he's received from his school and his community. He deserves a chance to prove what those of us who are listening already know, that he's exactly the kind of person any college would be proud to have as a student." The game had been suspended as Steve and the production team worked to connect Marcus with legal advocates who specialized in false accusation cases and with college admissions counselors who understood how to address disciplinary issues that had been resolved in the student's favor. Several colleges that learned Marcus's story through the episode later reached out to offer admission and scholarship opportunities. The episode aired 6 months later and became a powerful catalyst for discussions about due process and school discipline, the importance of thorough investigations, and the long-term consequences of false accusations on young people's lives. Educational reform organizations used Marcus's story to advocate for better protections for students facing disciplinary action. Marcus had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of the moment when someone with influence and authority had publicly acknowledged his innocence and affirmed his worth. More importantly, the exposure his story received had led to new opportunities and had helped restore some of the reputation and future prospects that had been unjustly taken from him. The jacket represented his understanding that truth doesn't always triumph immediately, but that persistence, character, and the support of people who believe in justice can eventually overcome even the most devastating false accusations. Because that's what integrity looks like when it faces injustice and refuses to surrender. That's what character sounds like when it maintains dignity despite being wrongfully attacked. And that's what happens when a 17-year-old young man learns that while the system may fail him, his worth isn't determined by other people's mistakes, and that sometimes the most important victories come not from avoiding injustice, but from surviving it with dignity and using the experience to help others who face similar struggles. Marcus Washington had been falsely accused and wrongly punished, but on that day at Family Feud, he discovered that his truth was still powerful, that his character was still intact, and that sometimes the greatest validation comes not from those who wronged you admitting their mistakes, but from people who matter, recognizing your worth and helping you rebuild the future that others tried to destroy.